Hello, everyone. We're just waiting. I see that a few more people are starting to arrive, so just going to take it a little bit steady whilst we gather everyone. But great to see so many of you out there and some sign of life. Yeah, warm welcome from me. I'm Jim Hendley. I'm producer at Dance4. Welcome to my living room. Yeah, before we hand over to Grace, I've got a few practical things I'll talk about, but I just also wanted to kind of acknowledge how we end up in this position. So we've had this kind of long-standing relationship between kind of many artists, understanding what the relationship is between dance and choreographic practices and the kind of museum and gallery kind of context, including through two active research projects at the moment, so dancing museums and reframing dance, and through a partnership project called the Continuous Network. There's lots of information on our website about those things, but we've had this kind of long-standing commitment to supporting practice-based research in many forms, often through our space in Nottingham and via our public programme. And so what we're hosting today is part of a series called Talking, Thinking, Dancing. It's a kind of annual program, but this time it focuses on dancing in the gallery. And yeah, we're slowly gathering through this year a series of events looking at this context through different ways. So look out for more events as part of that. But through all of our projects and programs, we've kind of had this ambition to create more resources and support for artists wanting to work in this context, and in particular from a kind of artist-led or practice-led research or response. And Grace started a dialogue with us about her ambition to create a dance pack that had very similar aims to some of ours. And so through this kinship, we've supported two sector conversation, small group meetings that have fed some perspectives in. And Grace will tell you a little bit more about the pack later and how you can access it. We've roughly got an hour with Grace and her team, and we'll go through without a break. So far, we've had a few technical issues with Grace's internet, but so far, in the last half an hour or so, things have been fine. If it goes a little bit wobbly, Zoom will catch up, so just bear with us. So Zoom today, hopefully most of you have got some experience of Zoom in the last year. There's a chat box at the bottom. If you click that somewhere, you can directly contact me. If you find Dance4, you can message me there. If there's something going wrong with your technology, I'll try and help you if I can. But we won't be using the chat box today to kind of contribute or kind of participate. It's very much about absorbing the things that are coming up for you. And there'll be a chance to feed back to Grace about the pack through an email address if you wish later. There's live transcript available. I'm just making that on now, actually. In your settings at the bottom, you can turn that on or off if you wish. And to get the best out of the content, you might want to play around with the different views you can do, depending on your device, but most people seem to be on a browser. If you go to the top corner, I think it's that way, there's a button that says view, and if you toggle between side-by-side speaker and side-by-side gallery, you'll see more or less faces or more or less screen, depending on what you want to do. And there's also a little bar between the large image you can see and my image that you can slide to the left or to the right. So it gives you a bit more of both screens as well. So play around with those to your heart's content. Yeah, and then I'll pop back up at the end. So I'm going to hand you over now to Grace, who's got some things she wants to share. So yeah.
Hello, everyone. Nice. Well, I can't see you, but thanks for coming. So yeah, I'm Grace and I'm a choreographer and curator, and my practice primarily deals with object-body relations and materiality. And I'm just going to hand over now to Natifah, who is one of my collaborators, who will introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Natifah and I'm an emerging artist and collaborator on the Mould Slippery project.
Thanks, Natifah. And now to Alethia.
Let me say that again. I'm Alethia and I'm one of the collaborators also on Grace's current project, and I'm also a performer, choreographer and researcher.
Great, thank you. So this is a video of the pack. It's just so you get a sense of what it looks like, and it's a little bit small, so you don't need to try and read it for now. So our current project, Mould Slippery, explored practices for working together in the studio and what it now means to make performance for public venues like galleries and museums. And through R&D studio time, we've been questioning the autonomy of the performer, the power dynamics of inviting people to be seen, and where power and responsibility lie within these exchanges. So by putting these ideas into practice, we found that we needed to have conversations about what our dance artists might need from venues and vice versa. So the public dance pack has been developed from our research, which is still in practice and evolving. It's an invitation for you all to join the conversation. Our intention isn't to offer the pack as a one-size-fits-all solution. It is to encourage venues and artists to navigate new ways of working, especially in the current environment of COVID and things like reduced funding. Our idea is to go beyond ordinary considerations and ask how we might all care for each other when negotiating a shared environment. So to help you get a feel for where the ideas in the pack have come from, I'm going to play this behind the scenes film that we created from the Mould Slippery project. So for this project, we're looking at how we can view the body from a sense of its materiality and view objects from a sense of their liveness or potentially their agency. Through this work with new materialism, we are invoking the ABJECT. This attentiveness to matter allows my practice a post-human understanding of vulnerability and agency, which is used as a lens through which we might dismantle structural issues through practice, both in the choreography itself and in how we work together as artists. I developed my choreography working with these concerns through current discourses, improvisation, objects, and specific collaborators. This process is developing a way of working that I've not come across before. So I think
it's to do with being attentive to the space. And I think one really good example that Grace does is just allow us to like describe what we see in the space. Because I think when I've performed in the past, I've just placed myself in a space, done the performance, gone home. Maybe I just never watched the video and like move on to the next project. But it's been cool to like constantly reiterate my awareness and my presence in the space. How do we develop ways of working that are non-extractive, that can be collective, they can be redistributing leadership, that doesn't have to rely on one person? How can we really play with, you know, these kind of hierarchies that, you know, exist in performance, especially when we are taking dance into spaces that are not expected, or like, you know, spaces where we don't expect to see dance, and then how that feels. And I think, again, it's practicing it and really like thinking, how does it feel in the body? Because, you know, you can talk about something and then your body can do something else. So it's kind of maybe marrying those two things. I think it's definitely helped me think about how I approach other creative processes with other people. How do I approach movement with other people in a space and remember that I'm still in the space too? I think in the past I still do, but I really like giving spaces to other people. And I've always been told, take your space or respect your contribution or effort to a project. So it's been really nice to think about that as well.
So the part that has resonated with me the most has been thinking about the presence of the body and in the moment decision making, like being in the room with your body in the space and your internal dialogue, reacting to things, looking at things, describing things, and then letting it resonate in your body. It's been really nice to do that, and it feels like you're really in reality, like you're really in the moment. And I really connect with that because it kind of breaks down the boundaries, and maybe this is what we've been like looking at as well. It breaks down the boundaries of subject and object and makes everything really equal. We give so much importance to humans and bodies and thoughts and all of that, which they are important, but connecting to knowing that everything is equal is really important. And I think that's what one of the things we've been looking at. So I guess, yeah, the presence of the body is one thing that has really resonated with me.
The thing that I've enjoyed the most about this whole R&D is just being in the space with people again, being able to move and be creative again, especially after the year that we've had. And for a lot of us, it was the first time back in a studio in over a year. And I remember the first day, it was really emotional and felt unusually strange because I think for most of us, the studio is such a space, like safe space. And yeah, just really validated for me how much it means to me to be able to dance with other people. It's been really inspiring and really beautiful.
I think attention is something that I've been working on, because I think watching people, I really see when they have their full attention in the moment and the material they're working with. So I've been kind of the last few days trying to find that in myself, and some days if I'm tired or some days where I might feel not so present, how do I still find that presence? And I think that's been kind of the thing that I've been working on through these days. And it's become easier as the days have gone on and got more used to the objects and more used to just moving in space with people again. But I think that's a constant thing. It's something that is not just happening in practice, but it is something that is almost like performative quality that's on top of whatever material we make. I think care is important in dance because it's dance is not just physical, it's emotional, it's mental. And I think sometimes in certain circumstances, we forget that how much actually, especially in work like this, there's so much questioning of identity and systems and disruption and things that are quite internal, but also things that are happening within the world. And I think it's important that in that context that we care for each other and are able to kind of facilitate people to feel safe in those conversations, and also just feel safe in their bodies while they're doing that. We've had a great pastoral care person, Temi, throughout the project. So we've had sessions with her like each time we come back to it. And that's been really great to just talk about the things that we might be struggling with, how that relates to our lives and how that relates to maybe other projects we've been doing. So yeah, I think care is a central part of, should be a central part of dance. And I think it's really important and great that Grace has made such an effort to make that an important part of her process.
Remember that dance can be a radical art form. Because dance transcends language, we have the ability to communicate so much more through dance work than we would by speaking or writing, for example. And so we have quite a big responsibility as dance artists to use that power and the communication that we have with our bodies to remain political and to remain radical and to push boundaries and encourage people to think outside their usual frameworks and see things with a different perspective and to get in touch with a part of themselves which they may not always be in touch with through the medium of dance.
I definitely got to understand a lot more how Grace is planning on working with the idea of sort of subject, object, sort of the idea of them becoming sort of almost one, or like the blurring the boundaries. So yeah, seeing how they kind of treated the cast pieces and started to kind of get to know them and then like breathe with them and like vibrate through them, even like lie on top of them or like try and mimic the shapes they made. Yeah, it was really interesting and useful.
So yes, sorry, just trying to get it onto the next thing. So yeah, as you could see from that video, fashion designer Sinead O'Dwyer and I have been collaborating with dance artists Alethia Antonia, Dorna Ashory, Iro Costello, Florence and Natifah, working on ideas of object-body relations in the context of dance, fashion, and public spaces like galleries and museums. And I'm super happy that Natifah and Alethia could join us today so they can talk about the project from their perspective. And you'll hear a bit more from them later. And as you saw from the film, the objects that we've been working with are garment objects which have been created by Sinead. And Sinead's garment objects are made by casting human bodies and fashioned with a combination of silks and silicone. And unfortunately, Sinead's busy schedule meant she couldn't be here today. So we've just made a short little video where she describes the process she went through for this specific project that I'm going to play now.
Yeah, we embedded before in the mold like the fabrics that are the color of the piece we want to make, which is kind of like I suppose quite a fleshy, maybe organy purple. And this will be, I think, Dorna's piece. So we kind of chose a different aspect of the inside of the body for each dancer to make the color palette after. So Dorna's is kind of like bit like a kidney kind of color. The next step will be to like fit it on her body, and probably change the width of the shoulder and maybe the length of the thighs, and also have a look how it works in relation to the undergarment she'll be wearing. So I'll develop the undergarments next week and the week after as well, and so kind of put that together and then maybe shape the pieces a bit based on that. And then we also have to make the straps and the clip construction for it.
So now you have a bit of a background of what we've been creating in the studio. I'm going to unpack a few of the ideas that we were working with, which fed into the pack. So during this project, we've been investigating and playing with ideas of a fixed, stable, or unified sense of self. So this idea links to the pack because just like you might construct your sense of self, a venue will also have a sense of what it is. The idea of a fixed sense of self comes from many theorists in different ways, including Iris Marion-Young, Judith Butler, Nirmal Purwar, and many others. And these theorists argue that we attempt to fix our sense of self through surrounding ourselves with things, people, and experiences that kind of reflect who we think we are. And some theorists argue that by determining who we are in this fixed way, we're also deciding what we are not. And when we do this, we inevitably involve ourselves in practices which exclude other people or even other them. So for example, I am me over here. What I am is fixed and separate from you over there who are not part of me. And this method of creating a subject naturalizes the appearance of its own creation through cultural and socio-political structures. This means that we may not notice that we're excluding other people, or we may think that it's normal to do so because the structures in place make it seem that way. So working with this concept has informed making the pack because just like when we decide what we are and what we're not, there will also be a sense of what or who fits or doesn't fit into a venue's identity. Sorry, there is an ice cream van. I don't know if you can hear it. So this is created. So this idea of what or who fits within the makeup of a venue is created by the people, systems, and things that make up that venue. And this is important to reflect on as artists, but also as venues, I think, because when programming and making dance work for these contexts, sometimes in these spaces, dance or even like the moving, living body is seen to be out of place. So through the project Mould Slippery and the pack, we've therefore been looking at how we can challenge our own borders or our sense of our own borders in order to challenge institutional or cultural borders. And this has led us to two key themes within the work. And the first theme is the idea of the abject. And I'm trying to change the slide. There we go. So the idea of the abject for us started with working with the object garments that Sinead created. And the object garments, as you can see from this image, give a sense of broken skin and exposed flesh. So because of this, when placed next to or on a living body, they can be seen as an extension of that body. This fleshy, skin-like quality of the object garments in relation to our bodies allowed us to play with the idea that the skin is not an impenetrable container of a coherent or fixed self. We were able to do this because of the very literal idea of breaking the skin. and the idea of assimilating an object into what I am. And this way of working is abject because it brings to mind an idea of spilling out from the body, which because of this can no longer be seen as discrete and separate from other people and things. So in this work, we've come to the understanding of the abject as something which is not dirty, disgusting, or unclean. Instead, the abject is something which disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules. So the idea of the self spilling out from the container of the skin is abject because it disturbs the fixing of identity and the orderly sense of how the border of the self should behave. And this theme links directly to the pack, and you'll see in the pack how it does, but through the idea that a dancing living body in a museum or gallery context might disturb the identity of the institution and therefore be abject in that space. And so the second theme that we've been working with in order to challenge boundaries is new materialism. And new materialism argues that objects have efficacy or that they can act. So the idea that objects can act can be explained simply through the idea that human beings cannot act in the world without objects and things to act upon or through. So for example, I cannot shoot you if I don't have a gun. And this idea argues for a leveling out between object and subject and decenters human agency. To further this idea of decentering human agency, new materialism also requires you to look at everything from the position of its or their materiality. And these ideas inform the idea of challenging the fixed self, which is separate from others further, because when viewing everything from a place of its or their materiality, it's harder to determine where you end and where I begin. This expansive view of how a self is constructed sees the self as an amalgamation of memories, objects, people, experiences, etc., that extend beyond the body. So this is where ideas of new materialism and the abject cross over and overlap. Viewing the self in this way could be seen as abject because this expansive view doesn't respect traditional ideas of borders and disrupts identity. So the reason for working in this way can be understood through Jane Bennett's book, Vibrant Matter, which states that this way of viewing the world can inspire a greater sense of the extent to which all bodies are kin, in the sense of inextricably enmeshed in a dense network of relations and in a knotted web of vibrant matter. To harm one section of the web may very well be to harm oneself. So this isn't to say that any inequalities don't exist or that we're all the same, but to understand that if we have this more expansive view of what makes up ourselves, then we can't avoid our connection to each other because what makes up ourselves overlap and interconnect. So I think it would be useful to hear now from Natifah, who'll just chat through how some of these ideas manifested in the studio for us from her perspective. So I'm just gonna mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Grace. So as part of the choreographic process and the making of Mould Slippery, each collaborator had the opportunity to work with Grace individually to grasp a deeper understanding of the themes. So I thought it would be interesting to share with you some of the findings from the solo session I had with Grace and how they then fed back into the main process. So during the solo sessions with Grace, we spoke a lot about objects, this idea of an extended self, the relationship between the object and the subject, and how we could potentially blur these. But of course, these ideas are really complex, and yeah, it was really hard to see how the body could potentially marry these ideas. And so one of the tasks that Grace asked me to do, which was very simple but was really interesting to see the outcomes, was to bring some objects into the studio that I felt I had a connection with. And then through time, we just played with placing and replacing the objects in the space, and just to basically explain my choices for them. So the more times I did this, the more times I realized that I would remove myself from the space in order to talk about my choices. And so the next time I did this activity, Grace asked me to also place myself in the space. And I think that this point was very pivotal in the understanding of the wider themes of new materialism and the abject, because it was for me one of the first times my body well, I would say it was digesting. It hasn't digested it yet, but was digesting and understanding quite a complex theme. So I remember I went to a secluded part of the room and I placed my objects in a particular way. And then I just took off my shoes and removed myself from the space without really thinking about why I did that or anything. I just thought, I'm just going to take my shoes off and then just see what happens. And so here, I just thought it'd be really nice for me just to share with you what I actually said and basically the reasoning behind my choice. And as you'll see later, this choice just appeared, and it also links to the point I was making about my body digesting these themes. So here's what I said about my shoes. I said, my shoes were because I wanted to be there, but wanted to be away at the same time. So I took off my shoes so I could see where I was. My shoes had another meaning beyond the use of being shoes. They became so that I could see myself in another place, which was also the past, a place that I had been, but also the present, because the shoes are physically there. So essentially what I was doing in this moment was replacing myself with an extension of myself so that I could be somewhere else. And for me, this was a great example of leveling this object subject relationship that me and Grace were talking about before, as well as linking how the shoes in this sense were holding agency and were almost relational and a reference to where I was, where I wasn't, and where I am all at the same time. And I guess just blurring where I was in the space. And so in this way, it made me think about this idea of a fixed sense of self and how far can we say this is where we begin and end when we're thinking about ourself, and potentially looking at intangible qualities that make up the self, the things that we don't see, and how they also make us fluid in a sense, and not bounded to a particular space or a space and time as well. So I guess, linking this to, again, the idea of the abject as well, it was also troubling, this idea of fixed self, because it made me question where I was, where I am, where I'm not. How do I know this? Who knows? But it was great because then when I went back into the studio with the other collaborators, the way in which we would collectively approach the objects, not as something that was in our space or not something that we were in there, but just this almost mutual understanding of our relationship with these objects, and how we would approach and handle these objects with care, as well as ourselves with care. So I just thought it would be nice just to share with you that in that example, there were many more, but it was pretty pivotal in the understanding of how new materialism and ideas relating to this and the abject were starting to kind of filter through my body, and were starting to almost become a bit more practical in that sense. So yeah.
Thanks, Natifah. Thank you for explaining that. That was great. So these ideas within new materialism are particularly important when we consider working within spaces like galleries or museums. So if we accept that the self is made up of lots of different things like people, memories, and objects, we might understand that the idea of what an institution is can be constructed in the same way. So this means that the objects in the gallery or museum, like the artifacts, the paintings, the sculptures, everything, not only make up how the institution is constructed physically, but also contribute to its cultural makeup. So this is particularly important to consider when the objects that galleries and museums own or display have hierarchies, traditions, or contentious histories. This is because from the viewpoint of new materialism, the objects have the potential to contribute to the creation of boundaries or borders in relation to the museum or gallery's identity. This means that objects contribute to who can engage and how people engage with a venue or performance work, and what experience the people who engage with that will have. So for example, if I go into a space that has an object which depicts something that's, sexist or something, or is made by someone who has sexist practices, how will that affect me or the reading of the work being shown? And so if an object has a contentious history or depicts something problematic, this has the potential to have a damaging effect on the performance work being shown, as well as the people who come into contact with them. Of course, it can also be used as a starting point for reflective conversations. So to this end, the pack contains suggestions to encourage venues to share with performance artists what the objects in their collections are, their histories, their construction, who made them, all of that information. And by doing this, the objects can be considered, and there is potentially less risk of being confronted in a space by an object which can act that we as the artists or even the audience members are not prepared for. So as you'll see from the pack as well, working with this sense of leveling out between subject and object might go in some way to disrupt the hierarchies of some objects within museum and gallery collections. For example, if there's an object which is seen to have greater reverence than a person, to challenge the idea that a body within a gallery or museum space as opposed to an art object is disruptive or out of place in those settings, and to disrupt potentially harmful audience-performer relationships. And what I mean by this disruption of audience-performer relationships is in reference to the idea of disrupting the gaze. So when we think about objects as bounded material things, this invokes the idea that an object is lifeless. And so then the idea of violence upon that object then becomes permissible because, of course, a lifeless thing can't be harmed. So the problematic nature of viewing objects in this way comes to light when we think about a gaze which is objectifying. So under the objectifying gaze, does violence acted out on the person who is objectified then also become permissible? So as discussed earlier in relation to Bennett, the sense of leveling out between subject and object challenges the idea of a fixed sense of self. So through this way of working, we're attempting to reorientate the relationship between viewer and the person being viewed. And this is possible because the themes ask the audience to attend to their own boundary and answer the questions: what will I assimilate? What will I take responsibility for? How am I vulnerable? And so in the video that you watched at the beginning, you heard some of my collaborators talk about tasks that we were doing where we would describe what we saw in the space, placing ourselves in relation to the space and developing an attentiveness to where each person was in the space and what they could see. And these tasks were my way of trying to resolve some of the implications or specific ways of working that gallery and museum spaces invoke. And these were resolving ideas about the autonomy of the performer, as we just spoke about in relation to audience-performer relationships. So these tasks sought to give the performer a presence that was not kind of like a contrived dance presence mode, but really place them solidly in the space. Also, the idea that objects and spaces that we perform in will act upon the work, as discussed just now in relation to objects with contentious histories. And following on from this idea that if objects and spaces can act, the work will be affected differently depending on the space that is performed in, because there'll be different objects. And therefore, this may be challenging if there is little time to make or rehearse the work in the performance space. And I kind of feel like these tasks give an attentiveness to space that doesn't ignore what is there. So through this method of working, we're able to draw on the specificity of each space so that the work is reflecting the environment or reflecting back at the environment that it's in. And this means that the work can still be, in a way, site-specific, but be performed in multiple venues, adhering to the ideas laid out in the themes that objects and spaces act. So it's not like just attempting to place the work on top of a space, but it's just really working with that space and what's there. So to explore the themes of new materialism and the abject further, we've been doing a lot of structured improvisations around these ideas. So placing bodies next to objects and making associations, or looking at the histories of our own bodies and how these histories are kept in our bodies, or how we can read them on our bodies in a certain sense. So for example, it might be as simple as saying that this is a scar that I have. And so the history is there in that scar physically on my body, or it might be our mannerisms or even the way we think. And what we would do is when we were describing these things, when we were describing the materiality of our body or the marks on our bodies that represent those histories, we then compared this to the object garments that Sinead created. So we looked at how we could read in the objects how they had also been constructed. So there was a comment, I think, from Natifah about how the edge of one of the casts had been cut, and you could tell that there had been multiple incisions to make that cut. So perhaps the knife wasn't sharp enough, or perhaps the cast silicone was too thick. And so you could see from the different angles of the cut that there had been multiple incisions. And so because of COVID, obviously, a lot of the original work that we were doing was through Zoom sessions and having discussions and really trying to get to a point of understanding with the themes and ideas of the work. So it's been really interesting to kind of move that into the studio and to see how these ideas that we've had, you know, lots of conversations about are actually manifesting through movement and are there in their bodies. And I have to say, working in this way was quite nerve-wracking before we were able to go in the studio, as I was thinking, we've had all these talks, but are they going to come out in the movement? And so, like Natifah said, it's been really nice to see that laying that foundation has actually really helped us to understand it through our bodies, now that we were able to go back into the studio. So another way that we researched the themes practically was to work with the object garments that Sinead created through further improvisational tasks. And as I said earlier, we're working with this idea of looking at the body from a place of its materiality and looking at objects from a place of their liveness, and how we can do that by making these associations between bodies and objects. So one of the exercises that we were doing was just simply placing the object garments on top of us and connecting to our breath and breathing in connection with these objects and seeing how our bodies might move these objects or how the objects might impede on or affect our movement. So we tried humming, and then we tried different kinds of singing with the objects resting on our bodies. And this was so that we could feel the reverberations that were moving our bodies, also moving the objects at the same time. As you saw in the behind the scenes video at the start, there was a lot of humming, and that was just to try and find a way in which we could connect with these objects and move these objects, but without it being like a deliberate thing, like I'm moving this object here. And so, yeah, as you can see from the themes and ideas that we're engaging with in the work, we're looking at challenging wider structures and where power and responsibility lie within these exchanges. And we're also contending with ideas of working in spaces where the dancing body might be out of place. And so this is obviously a lot to contend with for the performers. So another important part of the pack is looking at ideas of care and how we might care for each other when navigating a shared environment. So in terms of the idea of where responsibility lies in these exchanges, I take this incredibly seriously as a choreographer. And as you'll see from the pack, for artists, I believe this is about asking ourselves how we can share this responsibility and give venues the knowledge to care for us. So in terms of my practice and the practices that I work with and have been for this project, I've practiced this care by working with each dancer individually to explore what parts of the research have resonated with them in particular. I built in time at the start of each session for kind of check-ins and just to chat. And I created a pastoral care offer with artist Temi Ejose Cutting, which you can read more about in the pack. But just to finish off, we're going to hear from Alethia about how this offer has worked for her and her ideas of care. Over to you.
Thank you, Grace. Yes, so we had pastoral care sessions with Temi. I think we had about 5 over the project, and they were there for us to speak about anything that we felt we needed to discuss in relation to the work, but also in relation to our wider practices. I think a lot of the collaborators are working in various different ways outside of Grace's project. So there was also that space to reflect on things that have come up within sessions and how they might affect us in our day-to-day lives, and also within our other projects that we might be working on. I found this particularly useful. There was a lot of things I think came up initially in relation to ABJECT and in relation to this idea of the body holding keys, and this idea also of triggering spaces, triggering objects, connected, I guess, to what Grace was mentioning about the histories that are being held in certain venues and certain spaces. And a lot of my discussions with Temi at the beginning was to do with how at some points I felt in certain spaces that I was that abject, I was the out of place thing amongst spaces that I guess can be considered colonial or considered built in a way that has histories that in our day and age might be considered problematic. So it was really helpful for me because I feel like it did bring up some things that I didn't know how to deal with, And I felt like it gave me that space to go and talk about it. And I felt like also Grace in sessions herself was very open for us to talk about things that came up. And I was always very much like, if we need space and time to sit down or to digest something and then come back, that was always on offer. And it felt like a safe space. And I think that allowed us actually to delve deeper into these ideas, because I think there's something about Grace's work that kind of sits below the superficial. It's very deep. And I think the more layers that we went into, the more things came up for different people. So it was really important that we had that container of feeling safe within Grace's practice, and when we also stepped outside of the studio. So for me, it was, it's a way I haven't worked before with any other choreographer, and it's something that I have now also applied to my own practice. So thanks for the inspiration there, Grace. But I think it's incredibly important, and I don't think it's considered enough, both in an artist perspective, but also in relation to venues, institutions. And I think the idea of how can we care for each other, how can we care and assist people to make the best work and perform the best work is an important thing to bring to the forefront, I think, at this time, especially at this time.
Oh, thanks for that, Alethia. I didn't actually know what Alethia was going to say, so it's made me a bit emotional, but like, thank you, that's amazing. And actually, that's all we have time for. So we're going to put the link to the pack in the chat, and you'll also get an email from Dance4 with the link in as well, if you forget to copy it before you leave the webinar. And we decided that we thought it would make more sense to invite you to read the pack first and then contact me through this email that's on the screen right now. It's slipmoldslippery@gmail.com. And if you have any questions or you want to start a dialogue, I'm really open and I'd love to hear from all of you. So yeah, thanks so much for coming. And I think Jim's going to do some leaving things now.
Yeah. Hey. Oh, thank you, the three of you. I have now put that link in the chat there, but I promise that well, if you manage to get in today, we've got your email address, so we will follow up in an email as well with a link for that. Yeah, and do take up that that chance for dialogue with Grace if that's something you want to do. Yeah, so just a quick round of thank yous to the three of you for giving us such generous contributions, and yeah, for the kind of tenacity and incredible hard work that you've all clearly been up to in these really unusual times. It's just fantastic to see that that creativity hasn't stopped, even though we've been stopped in many ways. So yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, so I'm going to leave us here with that email address and the link. Please go to our website, check it out, get in touch with Grace if you've got any questions. Enjoy the rest of your day.